Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window of the transport ship and stared at Kepler Station Academy. The massive structure floated in space like a giant crystal flower, its curved walls reflecting the light from the nearby star. Hundreds of smaller ships moved around it like busy insects, bringing students from across the galaxy to the most famous school in known space. The 17-year-old human took a deep breath and tried to calm his nerves. He was the first student from Earth to ever attend the academy. His acceptance letter still felt like a dream, even though he had read it dozens of times during the long journey from his home planet. "Attention passengers," the ship's computer announced in a pleasant voice. "We will dock with Kepler Station Academy in 10 minutes. Please prepare for artificial gravity adjustment." Jake felt his stomach drop as the ship's gravity systems changed to match the Academy's settings. Everything felt lighter here, almost like he was floating. He had trained for this during his preparation on Earth, but it still felt strange. Transport ship slid into the docking bay with barely a sound. Through the windows, Jake could see other students waiting on the platform. His eyes widened as he got his first real look at his new classmates, a group of tall, thin beings that looked like they were made of living crystal stood together, their bodies catching and reflecting the station's lights. Their movements were slow and graceful, and they seemed to communicate by making soft musical sounds. Jake remembered from his briefing that these were Zephyrians, beings from a world with very low gravity and gentle winds. Near them, several squid-like creatures floated in mobile water tanks. Their tentacles moved in complex patterns as they spoke to each other in clicking sounds. The Nereid, Jake recalled. They came from ocean worlds and needed special equipment to survive in air. A cluster of insect-like beings with 6 arms and large compound eyes stood in perfect formation. Everything about them suggested order and discipline. The Qatari, a species known for their love of rules and structure. Finally, Jake saw what looked like walking plants. They moved very slowly, their green skin absorbing light from the stations. Artificial suns. The Verdani were peaceful beings who got most of their energy from photosynthesis. The transport door opened with a soft hiss, and Jake stepped out onto the platform. His boots made a solid thunk sound against the metal floor. The noise seemed incredibly loud in the quiet docking bay, and every conversation stopped. Hundreds of alien eyes turned to look at the newcomer. Jake tried to smile and wave, but his friendly gesture only made things worse. His teeth, perfectly normal by human standards, looked like the fangs of a predator to species that had evolved eating only plants and soft foods. Zephyrian student near the front of the crowd made a high-pitched sound of alarm and took several steps backward. The crystalline being's body flashed from blue to red, which Jake's training told him meant fear. Hello everyone," Jake said, trying to keep his voice quiet and friendly. But even his whisper seemed to boom in the station's thin atmosphere. Several more students backed away. Jake walked toward the main entrance, each step echoing through the bay like thunder. He was trying to move carefully, but his earth-trained muscles made him faster and stronger than anyone else in the room. What felt like a casual walk to him looked like aggressive stalking to the other students. A small group of Nereid students quickly moved their water tanks out of his path, their tentacles writhing in what Jake hoped was not panic. One of the Qatari began making rapid clicking sounds that his translator told him meant danger and retreat. The crowd parted before him like he was carrying a deadly disease. Jake felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. This was not how he had imagined his first day would go. He finally reached the main entrance, where a tall figure waited for him. Headmaster Vexte was unlike any being Jake had ever seen. The alien was nearly 8 feet tall but seemed to weigh almost nothing. Its body was translucent, like colored smoke, and it floated a few inches above the ground. "Welcome to Kepler Station Academy, Student Morrison," the headmaster said. Its voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. I am. Headmaster Vextai, we are honored to have the first human student join our institution. Jake noticed the pause before the word honored and wondered what the headmaster really thought about his presence. Thank you, sir, Jake replied, trying to make his voice as soft as possible. I'm excited to be here and learn alongside students from across the galaxy. Even his careful whisper made several nearby students flinch. Jake saw a young Verdani actually lose some of its leaves from what he assumed was stress. Yes, well, the headmaster continued, its smoky form shifting nervously. Perhaps we should proceed to your dormitory. The other students need time to adjust to your presence. As they walked through the academy's corridors, Jake marveled at the architecture. Everything was designed for beings who could float, glide, or move very slowly. The hallways were wide and filled with soft filtered light. The floors were made of some kind of cushioned material that absorbed sound, except for Jake's heavy footsteps, which echoed despite the padding. Students they passed in the halls pressed themselves against the walls as Jake walked by. He heard whispered conversations in dozens of languages, and his universal translator picked up words like Deathworlder, Predator, and Dangerous. The students seem nervous, Jake said carefully. They have never encountered a being from a class 12 Deathworld before, the headmaster replied. Your species is quite remarkable in its ability to survive in such hostile conditions. Most of our students come from Class 1 or Class 2 worlds, where the greatest danger might be a mild weather disturbance. Jake thought about Earth's hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, and the thousands of species that could kill a human in seconds. He was beginning to understand why the other students were afraid. They arrived at Jake's dormitory room, which had been specially modified for human habitation. The gravity was set to Earth normal, the atmosphere was thicker, and everything was built to handle the weight and strength of a human occupant. Your schedule has been uploaded to your personal device, the headmaster said, handing Jake a small tablet. Classes begin tomorrow. I do hope you will restrain yourself during physical activities. Restrain myself? Jake asked, confused. Your species' physical capabilities are quite extraordinary compared to our other students, the headmaster explained. What might seem like gentle movement to you could be terrifying to a Zephyrian or dangerous to a Verdani. Jake nodded, though. He still did not fully understand what the headmaster meant. How hard could it be to exercise with aliens who seemed so delicate? After the headmaster left, Jake unpacked his belongings and tried to process everything that had happened. He had known that humans were different from most galactic species, but he had not expected such a strong reaction to his mere presence. He looked at his class schedule and saw that he had something called Physical Wellness and Harmony first thing in the morning. It sounded like a fancy name for gym class. Jake smiled to himself. At least exercise was something he understood, regardless of what planet he was on. Outside his room, he could hear students in the hallway speaking in hushed tones. His translator caught fragments of their conversations, and most of it seemed to be about him. They called him the human, like it was a title of fear rather than simply his species. Jake settled into his bed, which felt strange in the lower gravity, and tried to stay optimistic. Tomorrow would be better. Once the other students got to know him, they would see that he was just a regular person who happened to come from a tougher world. He had no idea that his first gym class would turn their fear into absolute terror. Jake woke up feeling refreshed despite the strange low gravity. He had slept better than expected, though his dreams were filled with worried alien faces and the sound of his own footsteps echoing through empty hallways. Today was a new day, and he was determined to make a better impression on his classmates. He checked his schedule again and saw that his first class was Physical Wellness and Harmony. Jake had always been athletic back on Earth. He played soccer, ran track, and enjoyed most sports. Physical education was one class where he felt confident he could fit in and maybe even make some friends. After a quick breakfast in his room, Jake made his way to the gymnasium. The hallways were mostly empty since it was still early morning. The few students he passed gave him the same wide-eyed stares as yesterday, but he tried not to let it bother him. The gymnasium was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It was enormous, with a ceiling that seemed to stretch up forever. The walls were made of some soft, translucent material that glowed with gentle light. Instead of regular floors, there were sections of different surfaces. Some areas looked like thick gel, others seemed to be made of soft foam, and some sections appeared to float in midair. Equipment was scattered throughout the space, but none of it looked familiar. There were large, soap bubble-like spheres that students could apparently climb inside. Thin ribbons of light stretched between posts, creating obstacle courses that seemed to be made of pure energy. Pools of thick, silvery liquid dotted the floor, and students were slowly swimming through them like they were moving through honey dot. About 20 alien students were already in the gymnasium, moving through various exercises. Jake watched in amazement as a group of Zephyrians floated gracefully between the light ribbons, their crystalline bodies chiming softly as they moved. Several myriad students were gliding through the thick liquid pools, their tentacles barely disturbing the surface. A few Qitari were performing what looked like a complex dance, their 6 arms moving in perfect coordination. All of this activity stopped the moment Jake entered the room. The silence was complete and immediate. Every alien student froze in place, turning to stare at the human who had just walked into their peaceful exercise space. Jake felt his face grow hot with embarrassment, but he forced himself to smile and wave. "Good morning, everyone," he said, trying to keep his voice quiet and friendly. Even his whisper seemed to boom in the large space. Several students immediately began moving toward the exits, but before they could leave, a new figure appeared. Coach. Yilara was a Zephyrian, like many of the students, but older and more experienced. Her crystalline body was a deep blue color, and she moved with the fluid grace that all members of her species seemed to possess. When she spoke, her voice was like gentle music. "Welcome, students, to today's Physical Wellness and Harmony session," she said, her musical voice carrying easily through the gymnasium. "Today we have a new participant joining us. Student Morrison, please introduce yourself to the class." Jake stepped forward, and every student in the room took a step back. He tried not to notice this and gave what he hoped was a friendly smile. "Hi, everyone. I'm Jake Morrison from Earth. I'm looking forward to exercising with all of you and learning about your different approaches to physical fitness." The translator devices around the room buzzed as they processed his words, but the students' expressions only grew more worried. One of the Qitari students began making rapid clicking sounds that Jake's translator told him meant alert and prepare for danger. "Wonderful," Coach Ilara said, though her blue coloring had shifted to a nervous purple. "Let us begin with our warming exercises. Everyone, please assume the harmony position." The alien students moved to various spots around the gymnasium and began what Jake could only describe as the gentlest stretching he had ever seen. They moved so slowly that he could barely tell they were moving at all. A Zephyrian near him was taking nearly a full minute to raise one arm above her head. Jake tried to copy their movements, but his idea of slow motion was still much faster than theirs. When he raised his arm to stretch, the movement was smooth and controlled by human standards, but it looked like lightning to the watching aliens. Several students made sounds of alarm. "Student Morrison," Coach Yilara said carefully, "perhaps you could move with more harmony. Try to feel the gentle flow of energy through your body." Jake nodded and tried to move even slower. He attempted to raise his other arm with a deliberate care of someone defusing a bomb. To him, it felt ridiculously slow. To the alien students, it still looked like the controlled movements of a predator preparing to strike. "Better," the coach said, though her color had now shifted to a worried yellow. Now let us proceed with strength-building exercises. She led the class to an area with what looked like resistance bands, but they were made of some kind of energy rather than physical material. The alien students took hold of these bands and began pulling on them with the sort of effort Jake might use to lift a feather. Jake grabbed one of the energy bands and gave it what he thought was a gentle tug. The band snapped immediately, sending a pulse of light through the gymnasium and causing several students to cry out in alarm. "Oh no, I'm sorry," Jake said quickly. "I didn't mean to break it." "Break it?" Coach Lara stared at the destroyed equipment with wide eyes. "These resistance bands are designed to provide a lifetime of use. They're rated for forces up to... Well, no one has ever broken one before." Jake looked around at the other students, who were now staring at him like he had just demonstrated the ability to tear apart solid steel with his bare hands. In a way, he supposed he had. "Let's try something else," the coach said, leading them to a different area. "Perhaps the endurance pools will be more suitable." The endurance pools were filled with that thick, silvery liquid Jake had noticed earlier. The alien students entered the pools and began swimming through the viscous fluid with slow, graceful movements. It was clearly designed to provide resistance training, like swimming through honey. Jake lowered himself into one of the pools and immediately felt how thick the liquid was. It was like trying to move through very thick pudding. He began swimming, using the easy strokes he had learned in his high school swim team. The problem was that what felt like easy swimming too. Jake created waves in the thick liquid that crashed over the sides of the pool. The other students were thrown around like leaves in a hurricane. Several of them had to be pulled from the pool by the safety equipment, and one young Nereid was so disoriented that she forgot to activate her breathing apparatus and nearly drowned in air. "Stop! Stop!" Coach Lara called out, her crystalline body now flashing bright red with panic. "Everyone out of the pools immediately." Jake pulled himself out of the pool, dripping with the silvery liquid. He looked around at the chaos he had accidentally created and felt terrible. Students were scattered around the gymnasium, some looking shaken, others looking terrified. "I'm really sorry," he said. "I was trying to be gentle. I didn't know it would cause so much trouble." "Gentle?" squeaked a small Zephyrian student named Chimes in Wind. "You moved through that liquid like it was water. No one can swim that fast through a resistance pool." Jake was about to explain that it had felt quite difficult to him, but Coach Lara held up a hand for silence. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we should try something more controlled, a simple flexibility exercise. Just touching your toes, Student Morrison. Surely that cannot cause any harm." Jake nodded eagerly, happy to do something that seemed safe. He bent forward to touch his toes, a simple movement he had done thousands of times in his life. The alien students gasped in horror. What Jake didn't realize was that his simple toe touch demonstrated a range of motion that was impossible for most the lactic species. His spine bent in ways that would break the backs of most aliens, and he did it as easily as breathing. To the watching students, it looked like he was folding his body in half without any mechanical assistance. "By the great harmony," whispered Coach Lara, "how are you not dead?" "Dead?" Jake straightened up, confused. "It's just touching my toes. Don't you guys stretch?" "Stretch, yes," said a Qatari student nervously. "But we use mechanical aids and safety equipment. No one bends their body like that with just muscle power." Jake looked around at the frightened faces surrounding him and finally began to understand the scope of the problem. These aliens didn't just come from gentler worlds. They came from worlds where the basic physical capabilities he took for granted were literally impossible. Coach Lara was making notes on a glowing tablet, her hands shaking slightly. "I think," she said, "that we should end today's session early. Student Morrison, perhaps you could practice privately until we can develop a suitable program for your unique needs." As the other students quickly left the gymnasium, Jake stood alone in the middle of the vast space. He had only been trying to participate, to fit in and make friends. Instead, he had terrified everyone and probably set back human-alien relations by decades. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had effortlessly broken equipment designed to last forever. He thought about his casual swimming that had created chaos, and his simple stretching that had looked like a medical impossibility to his classmates. By the next morning, Jake had become the most famous student at Kepler Station Academy, but not in the way he had hoped. The story of the gymnasium disaster had spread through every dormitory, every classroom, and every common area on the station. With each telling, the tale grew more frightening. Jake walked to his first class of the day, Advanced Galactic History, and noticed that the hallways emptied before him like he was carrying a dangerous disease. Students would see him coming and quickly duck into side passages or press themselves against the walls until he passed. The few who couldn't avoid him completely stared at him like he was a wild animal that might attack at any moment. When he entered the history classroom, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The 23 alien students who had been chatting quietly among themselves fell completely silent. Several stood up as if preparing to run. Others activated what looked like personal protective devices, creating shimmering energy shields around themselves. Professor Veltar, an elderly Verdani whose bark-like skin was covered in wisdom marks, tried to maintain order. "Please, students, take your seats. We have much to cover about the great peace treaties of the Andromeda sector." Jake found an empty seat in the back corner, hoping to be less noticeable. But as he walked across the room, his footsteps echoed loudly on the polished floor. The sound made several students flinch with each step. When he finally sat down, the chair creaked under his weight, and a young Zephyrian near him actually whimpered in fear. The professor began the lecture, but Jake could tell that no one was paying attention to the lesson. Every few seconds, students would glance back at him nervously. When he shifted in his seat to get more comfortable, half the class turned to look. When he reached into his bag to get a notebook, several students activated their emergency alert devices. During a discussion about peaceful conflict resolution, Jake raised his hand to ask a question. The simple movement of lifting his arm caused 3 students in the front row to immediately stand up and move to seats farther away from him. "Yes." "Student Morrison?" Professor Veltar asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I was wondering about the enforcement mechanisms for these peace treaties," Jake said, trying to speak as softly as possible. "What happens if someone breaks the agreement?" Even his quiet question seemed to boom in the silent classroom. The professor's leaves rustled nervously, which Jake had learned was a sign of stress in Verdani. "Well," the professor replied slowly, "the treaties rely on the basic nature of civilized species to resolve disputes through discussion and compromise. Violence is simply not considered a viable option among developed cultures." Jake nodded, but he noticed several students exchanging worried looks. His translator picked up whispered words like enforcement and violence from their conversations. He was beginning to realize that even asking about conflict resolution made him seem dangerous to species that had never experienced war. After class, Jake tried to approach a group of students to introduce himself properly, but they scattered before he could get close. One young Kitari named Clicks rapidly actually ran into a wall in his hurry to get away from the approaching human. Jake's next class was interspecies biology, and he hoped it might go better. Surely a science class would be more objective and less frightening. He was wrong. When Dr. Korayosong, a Nereid professor floating in a mobile water tank, began discussing the physical characteristics of different species, Jake became the unwilling center of attention. "Now, class, we are fortunate to have a representative of a Class 12 Deathworld species with us today," the professor announced, gesturing toward Jake with one of her tentacles. "Student Morrison, Would you mind if we discuss some of the remarkable adaptations your species has developed? Jake felt uncomfortable being put on the spot, but he nodded politely. Sure, I guess that would be okay. Excellent, Dr. Coral Song continued. Now humans have evolved what we call persistence hunting capabilities. They can run continuously for hours without stopping, chasing prey until it collapses from exhaustion. Student Morrison, is this accurate? Well, humans can run long distances. Jake admitted, but we don't really hunt like that anymore. We have grocery stores now. Several students gasped at the mention of hunting, and Jake's explanation about grocery stores didn't seem to reassure them. A Zephyrian student named Sings with Stars raised a trembling crystalline hand. But you still have the ability to hunt like that? She asked in a voice like tinkling bells. You could chase someone for hours if you wanted to? I mean, technically yes, Jake said, not understanding why this was such a big deal. I ran cross-country in high school. But I would never chase anyone. That would be weird and wrong. His attempt to reassure them only made things worse. The students now knew for certain that Jake possessed the physical ability to hunt them down, even if he claimed he wouldn't use it. Dr. Coral Song continued the impromptu lesson. Humans also have remarkable strength-to-weight ratios. They can lift and move objects weighing many times their own body weight, and their reaction times are adapted for dodging large predators and catching fast-moving prey. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat as every eye in the room focused on him. Look, I'm really not that strong or fast. I'm pretty average for a human, actually. Average? Dr. Coral Song's tentacles writhed in what Jake was learning to recognize as amazement. Student Morrison, yesterday you broke a resistance trainer. That was designed to withstand forces equivalent to a small starship engine. It was an accident, Jake protested. I barely touched it. Barely touched it, repeated a Verdani student in a voice full of wonder and terror. He barely touched equipment designed for starships, and it broke. The whispers started again, spreading around the classroom like wildfire. Jake heard fragments of conversation through his translator. Starship strength. Barely trying. What happens if he gets angry? The situation grew worse when Dr. Coral Song decided to demonstrate human reflexes. She programmed a holographic display to show images at random intervals around the room, asking Jake to point to them as they appeared. What the professor didn't realize was that the exercise was designed for species with much slower reaction times. Jake easily pointed to each image as it appeared, his movements quick and precise. But to the alien students, his speed looked superhuman. His hands moved so fast they created small sonic booms in the station's thin atmosphere. Fascinating, Dr. Coral Song murmured, making notes on her tablet. Student Morrison, you realize you just demonstrated reaction times nearly 4 times. Faster than our quickest species? Jake stared at her in shock. 4 times faster? But that felt normal to me. Normal, whispered Clicks rapidly, who had been taking shelter behind a larger Qatari student. Super speed is normal for him. By the time Jake left biology class, he had accidentally proven to his classmates that he was not only incredibly strong, but also impossibly fast. The combination was terrifying to species that had evolved on gentle worlds, where the biggest predator was roughly equivalent to a house cat. At lunch, Jake sat alone in the academy's main dining hall. The vast room was designed to accommodate hundreds of students from dozens of species, with different atmospheric zones and feeding areas. But wherever Jake sat, a large empty space formed around him as other students found reasons to eat elsewhere. He tried reading while he ate, hoping to look less threatening, but even this backfired. A group of Zephyrian students at a nearby table began discussing his reading habits and musical tones that his translator picked up. Look how fast he processes information, one of them chimed. He's reading at least 5 times faster than normal. It's like his brain works at the same accelerated pace as his body, another replied. Imagine how quickly he could learn to hurt someone. Jake looked up from his book, frustrated. I'm not learning to hurt anyone. This is just a novel about space exploration. But his explanation only made things worse. The students had seen him reading what looked like technical manuals at superhuman speed, and now they knew his enhanced abilities extended to his mind as well as his body. After lunch, Jake had a free period and decided to visit the Academy's famous botanical gardens. The gardens were a peaceful place where students from all species could relax among plants from their homeworlds. Jake hoped that being around growing things might help him feel less like a monster. He entered the gardens quietly, trying not to disturb the few students who were there. The space was beautiful, with sections designed to mimic dozens of different planetary environments. He found Earth section and sat down near some familiar oak trees, breathing in the scent of home. For a few minutes, Jake felt peaceful. Then he noticed that the other students in the gardens were leaving. Not quickly or obviously, but steadily, until he was completely alone among the plants. The isolation was becoming unbearable. Every attempt Jake made to connect with his classmates only made them more afraid of him. When he tried to help a Verdani student who had dropped her books, his quick movement to assist her looked like an attack to nearby witnesses. When he offered to share his notes with struggling students, they were too terrified to get close enough to accept them. The breaking point came during his last class of the day, peaceful conflict resolution. Jake didn't sleep that night. He spent hours staring out his window at the stars, thinking about the mess he had made of everything. By morning, news of his classroom outburst had spread throughout the entire academy. Students were now avoiding entire sections of the station just to make sure they wouldn't accidentally encounter him. At breakfast time, Jake received a message on his tablet. Headmaster Vextai wanted to see him in the administrative offices immediately. Jake knew what this meant. His time at the academy was over before it had really begun. He walked through the empty corridors, his footsteps echoing like drumbeats. In a funeral march, the few maintenance workers he passed quickly found important tasks that required them to be somewhere else. Even the cleaning robots seemed to move faster when they detected his approach. The administrative office was located in the heart of the station, a grand space with floating platforms and shimmering energy displays. Headmaster Vextai waited for him there, along with several other faculty members. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but Jake could see the worry in their alien features. "Student Morrison," the headmaster began, his voice like wind through Crystal Caves, "we need to discuss your continued enrollment at this academy." "I know," Jake said quietly. "I've scared everyone. I never meant to, but I understand if you want me to leave." "The situation is indeed serious," said Dr. Coral Song, her tentacles moving in agitated patterns inside her water tank. "Several students have requested transfers to other institutions. Parents are threatening to remove their children from the academy." Professor Mind of Calm spoke up, his crystalline form flickering between colors. "However, we must also consider the importance of the cultural exchange program. Your presence here represents a significant step forward in human-galactic relations." Jake felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly dampened by the headmaster's next words. "We have decided to give you one final opportunity to prove that you can coexist peacefully with your fellow students," Headmaster Vextai announced. "If you can demonstrate that you are not a threat to academy life, you may remain. If not, you will be returned to Earth immediately." "What kind of demonstration?" Jake asked. The faculty members exchanged glances before the headmaster continued. "You will participate in a formal competition with our academy's champion athlete, Zephina. If you can compete fairly and safely, without causing harm or terror, we will consider allowing you to continue your studies under careful supervision." Jake's heart sank. A competition was exactly the wrong thing to suggest. Any physical contest would only highlight the differences between himself and the alien students. But he also realized this was his only chance. "I accept," he said. "When is this competition?" "Tomorrow evening, in the main gymnasium," the headmaster replied. "The entire student body will attend. This will be your opportunity to show them that you can control your abilities." Jake left the meeting feeling more worried than ever. How could he possibly compete against an alien athlete without looking terrifying? Everything he did seemed impossibly powerful to these gentle beings. Word of the upcoming competition spread faster than Jake had thought possible. By afternoon, it was the only topic of conversation anywhere on the station. Students spoke about it in hushed, frightened tones, as if they were discussing an execution rather than an athletic event. Jake tried to learn more about Zephina, the Academy's champion athlete. What he discovered didn't make him feel any better. Zephina was a Zephyrian, known for her incredible grace and precision in low-gravity sports. She held records in aerial dancing, harmonic resonance, and something called crystal singing, which seemed to involve making music while floating through complex patterns. More importantly, Zephina was beloved by the entire student body. She was kind, gentle, and represented everything that the Academy valued about peaceful competition. Jake realized that in the eyes of his classmates, he was going to be the brutal Deathworlder fighting against their beloved champion. The day of the competition arrived far too quickly. Jake spent the morning trying to figure out how to be gentle, enough not to terrify anyone while still participating meaningfully in the contest. He practiced moving as slowly as possible, speaking as softly as he could, and trying to make his facial expressions as non-threatening as possible. None of it felt natural or comfortable, but he was determined to try. As evening approached, the main gymnasium filled with students from every species at the Academy. They came not out of excitement for the competition, but out of morbid curiosity and genuine fear about what the human might do. Emergency medical teams were stationed around the room, and several faculty members had portable protective shields. Ready. Jake entered the gymnasium to complete silence. Hundreds of alien eyes watched his every movement, looking for any sign of the violence they expected from him. He tried to smile and wave, but even this simple gesture made several students in the front rows lean back in fear. Zephina was already in the gymnasium, floating gracefully near the center of the space. She was beautiful in the way that all Zephyrians were, her crystalline body catching and reflecting the light in patterns that seemed almost musical. When she moved, it was like watching a living work of art. "Welcome, students and faculty, to this special demonstration of interspecies athletic cooperation," announced Headmaster Vextai. "Today, student Morrison and champion Zephina will compete in traditional Zephian sports, showcasing the values of precision, grace, and harmonious movement. The first event was aerial dancing, which involved floating through a series of energy ribbons while maintaining perfect balance and creating pleasing visual patterns. Zephina went first, and her performance was breathtaking. She moved like a poem written in light, her crystalline body singing soft melodies as she danced through the glowing obstacles. When it was Jake's turn, he tried to copy her movements as carefully as possible. He had trained himself to move slowly and deliberately, but his version of graceful still looked powerful and controlled compared to Zephina's ethereal flowing. Where she drifted like a gentle breeze, he moved like a carefully controlled force of nature. The watching students gasped as Jake navigated the energy ribbons. His movements were precise and controlled, showing a level of bodily discipline that was actually quite impressive. But to the aliens, it looked like barely contained violence. They could see the power in his muscles, the strength he was holding back, and it terrified them. The second event was harmonic resonance, where competitors had to create musical tones while moving through increasingly complex patterns. Zephina's performance was like listening to a crystal wind chime in a gentle breeze, creating melodies that seemed to touch the soul. Jake's attempt was more problematic. His vocal cords, designed for a much thicker atmosphere, produced sounds that were technically correct, but had undertones of power that the Zephyrian students found disturbing. Where Zephina's voice was like a gentle stream, Jake's was like a controlled waterfall, but something unexpected began to happen during this second event. A few students in the audience started to notice something important about Jake's performance. Yes, his movements were powerful and his voice was strong, but they were also incredibly controlled. He was clearly holding back enormous strength and using only the minimum force necessary. The real turning point came during the third event, precision floating. This required the competitor to move through a series of narrow spaces without touching any of the boundaries. It was designed to test fine motor control and spatial awareness. Zephina performed flawlessly, as expected. Her crystalline body flowed through the obstacles like water finding the easiest path. When Jake's turn came, something remarkable happened. He approached the course with such careful attention to his movements that every gesture became deliberate and thoughtful. As he navigated through the narrow spaces, the audience could see him actively restraining his natural impulses to move quickly and powerfully. For the first time, the alien students saw Jake's strength not as a threat, but as something he was choosing not to use. They watched him deliberately slow his reflexes, carefully control his movements, and treat the delicate course with the same gentleness they would use with a newborn. A young Verdani student named Grows in Sunlight whispered to her friend, "Look how careful he's being. He could probably break through those barriers easily, but he's treating them like they're made of flower petals." The audience began to murmur among themselves. They were seeing something they had never considered before. The human was dangerous. Yes, but he was choosing not to be dangerous. Every movement he made was a conscious decision to be gentle. The revelation reached its peak during the final event, assisted partnering. Zephina had to guide Jake through a complex aerial routine while he supported her weight and followed her lead. This was the most dangerous part of the competition, as it required Jake to be in direct physical contact with the delicate Zephyrian. The entire gymnasium held its breath as Jake approached Zephina. She was so fragile compared to him that he could probably break her accidentally just by gripping too tightly. Everyone expected disaster. Instead, they witnessed something beautiful. Jake's hands, which they had seen break unbreakable equipment, held Zephina with the gentleness of someone cradling a soap bubble. Jake woke up the next morning to something he hadn't experienced since arriving at the academy: the sound of normal conversation in the hallways. Students were no longer whispering in terrified voices or fleeing at the sound of his footsteps. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was real. When he left his room to go to breakfast, a young Kitari student named Clicks in Harmony actually nodded to him instead of running away. It was a small gesture, but it made Jake's day feel brighter. Immediately, the dining hall was still mostly empty around Jake's table, but now it felt more like respectful distance than terrified avoidance. A few students even glanced at him with what looked like curiosity rather than fear. When he accidentally dropped his fork and it clattered loudly on the floor, only half the room flinched instead of the entire population diving for cover. Jake's first class was Advanced Mathematics and Professor Datastream, an artificial intelligence housed in a floating crystal matrix, seemed pleased to have a student who could keep up with the complex calculations. Jake had always been good at math, but he was careful to work at a normal pace and not demonstrate the same superhuman processing speed that had terrified his biology classmates. During the lesson on multidimensional calculus, Jake raised his hand to ask a question about practical applications. This time, when he spoke, the other students listened to his words instead of just reacting to the power in his voice. "I was wondering," Jake said carefully, "how these equations might be used in terraforming calculations for hostile environments." The question sparked a genuine discussion about planetary engineering, and Jake found himself participating in his first real academic conversation since arriving at the academy. Several students even built on his ideas, treating him like a colleague rather than a threat. After class, something remarkable happened. Flows like water, the Nereid student who had been his partner in the disastrous conflict resolution exercise, approached him hesitantly. "Student Morrison," she said, her tentacles moving in patterns that Jake's translator told him meant nervous but friendly intent. "I wanted to apologize for my reaction yesterday. I realize now that you were not threatening me. Please, call me Jake," he replied, keeping his voice gentle. "And there's nothing to apologize for. I understand why my behavior seemed scary. I'm still learning how to interact with people from different worlds." "Jake," she repeated, testing the unfamiliar human name. "Would you perhaps like to study together for our upcoming galactic politics exam? I think your perspective on resource conflicts might be valuable." Jake felt a warm surge of happiness. This was his first real invitation to friendship since arriving at the academy. "I'd like that very much." As they made plans to meet in the library later, Jake noticed other students, watching their interaction with interest rather than horror. Word was spreading that the human could have normal, peaceful conversations. The real test of Jake's new acceptance came during his lunch period. He was sitting alone as usual when Sci-Fi floated over to his table, her crystalline body chiming softly with each movement. "May I join you?" she asked, her musical voice carrying clearly across the dining area. Jake looked up in surprise. "Of course, but are you sure? I don't want to cause problems for you with the other students." Sci-Fi settled gracefully into a chair across from him, her presence immediately attracting attention from around the dining hall. "After yesterday's performance, I think I understand you better than most," she said. "You carry great strength, but you use it to protect and support others. That is something to be admired, not feared." As they talked, other students began to cautiously approach. First came Grows in Sunlight, the young Verdani who had started the applause the night before. Then Clicks in Harmony joined them, followed by several other students who had been in the gymnasium. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Jake found himself at the center of a social group, instead of an empty circle of fear. The conversation was stilted at first, with students still unsure how to interact with him, but gradually it became more natural. "What is Earth really like?" asked Grows in Sunlight, her bark-like skin rustling with curiosity. "The databases say it's a death world, but you seem so normal." Jake thought carefully about how to answer. "Earth is dangerous compared to your worlds," he admitted. "We have storms that can destroy cities, earthquakes that crack the ground open, and animals that could kill you just by stepping on you. But it's also beautiful. We have forests and oceans and mountains that take your breath away." "How do you sleep at night knowing such dangers exist?" asked a Zephyrian student named Hums with Stars. "I think humans got used to it over millions of years," Jake explained. "We learned to work together, to protect each other, and to be careful. The dangers made us strong, but they also made us want to take care of those who couldn't protect themselves." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden alarm that echoed throughout the dining hall. Red warning lights began flashing, and the station's emergency announcement system activated. "Attention all students and faculty," came the mechanical voice. "We are experiencing a critical systems failure due to unexpected solar storm activity. Artificial gravity and atmospheric systems are failing in sections 100 to 7 through C12. All students in those areas must evacuate immediately. Emergency teams are responding." Jake looked around the dining hall and saw panic beginning to spread among the students. These beings had never experienced a real emergency before. Their worlds were so safe and controlled that the concept of immediate physical danger was foreign to them. "The C-sections," Flows Like Water said, her tentacles writhing with worry. "That's where the first-year dormitories are located. There are dozens of students trapped in those areas." Through the dining hall's windows, Jake could see the affected sections of the station. Emergency lights were flashing, and he could see debris floating in the corridors where gravity had failed. Several students were visible through the windows, trapped in rooms or stuck floating helplessly in the hallways. The Academy's emergency teams were moving as quickly as they could, but they were designed for medical emergencies and minor technical problems, not major disasters. Their equipment was built for the delicate physiology of galactic species, not for moving through dangerous, debris-filled areas. Jake stood up from the table, his expression growing serious. "I need to help." "Help?" Zephaniah looked at him with confusion. "The emergency teams are handling the situation." "Look at them," Jake said, pointing toward the windows. "They're moving too slowly. Those students are scared and hurt, and some of those areas look like they're about to lose atmospheric pressure completely. People could die while we're waiting for the proper equipment." Without waiting for permission, Jake headed toward the emergency exit that led to the damaged sections. Behind him, he heard Zephaniah calling out, "Jake, wait! It's too dangerous." But Jake was already moving. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, he stopped trying to hide his capabilities. He ran through the corridors at full speed, his footsteps thundering like drums. Emergency force fields parted before him as his student identification was recognized by the station's computers. The alien students he had been eating lunch with followed him to the observation windows, watching in amazement as Jake disappeared into the damaged sections of the station. They could see him through the transparent walls, moving through areas that would be impossible for their species to navigate. In the first damaged corridor, Jake found 3 Zephyrian students floating helplessly near the ceiling, unable to control their movement without gravity. He jumped up to reach them, his earth-trained muscles easily carrying him 12 feet into the air in the station's low gravity. One by one, he guided them to safety, his strong hands gentle on their crystalline bodies. In the next section, a young Kitari was trapped under debris that had fallen when the gravity failed. Jake lifted the twisted metal beam that would have required mechanical equipment for any other species to move. The Kitari student looked up at him with wonder instead of fear. "Thank you," Clicks rapidly whispered. "I thought I was going to die." "Not on my watch," Jake replied, helping the injured student to his feet. The most dangerous rescue came in Section C10, where atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly. A Nereid student named Swims in Starlight was trapped in a flooded room, her breathing apparatus damaged and her water tank cracked. The emergency teams couldn't reach her because the corridor was filled with floating debris and electrical hazards. Jake swam through the dangerous water, his human lungs allowing him to hold his breath far longer than should have been possible. He found Swims in Starlight unconscious near the bottom of the flooded room and brought her to the surface, sharing his own air until they could reach safety. By the time the station's emergency systems were restored, Jake had rescued 17 students from the damaged sections. He had carried the injured, guided the lost, and protected the frightened. Most importantly, he had used his terrifying strength and speed not to hurt anyone, but to save lives. As Jake emerged from the last damaged corridor, carrying a young Verdani who had been too shocked to move, he found the entire academy waiting for him. Students, faculty,